All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD 1111 Database-Driven Web Development course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based on some of the PDFs from the Valley of Code, which are some documents and handbooks that have been written by Mr. Flavio Copes. So far, I've done most of the stuff I wanted to go through in here for Mr. Cope's server-side development. I've created about 5 things from his HTML handbook, about 10 from his CSS, and about 5 from his JavaScript handbook. Now, later I'm going to go into the Node.js and the React, but before I do that, I've decided a couple things. First off is I have somewhere in here, I bought this book from Brad Traversy. He doesn't typically put out books, but basically it's 300 pages about just about everything you could think of. I'm going to do basically kind of a synopsis of this book, and I don't know how many. It may take 5, it may take 10 different lectures. I'm going to do that. I'm also going to go back into our textbook that we had in the first semester, that being Murox, JavaScript, and jQuery, and I'm going to go back over several chapters in here. In particular, chapter 4, because chapter 4 goes into how to work with function declarations, and then it gets into function expressions, and then it gets into arrow functions, which we need to know before we get into Node.js. All right, so I'm going to do that, and then after I get done with chapter 4, I'm not going to go back over any of these chapters. Probably 6 may not be a bad idea, how to script the DOM, but I'm not going to. And I'm not going to go over any of these. But jumping down here, I'm going to go through chapter 15 as well, which is how to work with arrays, sets, and maps. All right. I've talked about some of this stuff, but even to show you, the more examples you can see, the better. Finally, I'm going to go back. So I'm going to do 4 and 15. And then I'm going to go back and just go through this preliminary chapter on how to use Node. All right. And that'll kind of bridge us from the client side to the server side. All right, so just so you know what's coming up. But for now, I want to finish what's in here in the JavaScript handbook from Flavio Copes. So some of this again will be talked about later, but he gives a very limited view of arrow functions and talking about things like promises, etc. Okay, so arrow functions are a recent addition. They're a shortcut, for lack of better words. So rather than saying function get data like this, all right, you typically don't give the function a name and you use what's called the fat arrow syntax, which is an equal sign followed by a greater than sign. Arrow functions, again, are anonymous. So you would basically rewrite this like this. Now, if you may say, well, that doesn't buy me all that much, I'm not even going to agree or disagree with you on this. But what I want to say is what you will find is more and more when you see Node code, all right, so code that's involving anything with Node.js, we'll be using the request and the response object of our HTTP, or the request and response methods of our HTTP object. And we're going to be seeing this virtually all the time. All right, if you're only returning one line here, you can put everything in one line. Okay, if you've got multiple parameters, they must be put in parentheses. If you have only one parameter, you can omit the parentheses if you want to. I find that harder to read, so I always use the parens. But if there are no parameters, you must put the parentheses in there. All right. You can set up default parameters. Arrow functions can contain other arrow functions. Now that was unbelievably quick. So we're going to look at it again when I go back over the stuff from our old textbook. All right, so I'm just going to jump all the way up. I think this is the right page. Of course it's not, but we're going to get there. We go. Into asynchronous programming and callbacks. All of this stuff, arrow functions, asynchronous programming, callbacks, promises, it's all related. All right, and what do I mean by this? Well, most of the time, as it says here, you want JavaScript code to run synchronously. Now think about it. If you don't understand what synchronous and asynchronous are, think of the class that you're in right now. Some of you are probably, if I was to give this in a lecture right now and be doing this in Teams right now in a lecture, some of you might be there listening to it at the time I'm giving the lecture. So if you had questions, you could ask immediately, etc. That's synchronous. We're in sync. Some of the rest of you, because you might have different work hours or whatever, so some of the rest of you might watch this later, watch the tape later or whatever, and get back to me at a later time with questions. That's asynchronously. All right. So since most of the time JavaScript code is run synchronously, as it says, it means that a line of code is executed, then the next one, then the next one. And that's pretty much how it works in most programming languages. But sometimes you can't wait for code to execute. Now, this may not sound like a big thing. You can't wait for 2 seconds for a file to load, but it is a big thing. Sometimes it'll take more than that. What if you're searching? What if you have to open up a database? What if the database has 1 million records in it and you're searching for one record out of 1 million that meets criteria you might be offering? That might take a lot more than that. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to tie up your network resources. You want to be able to go on and do something else. And the way you end up doing that has changed historically. It started with callbacks, then it went to promises, then it went to async await. They're all kind of different sides of the same coin, if you could imagine a coin with 3 sides. But it's gotten better over time. Callbacks can lead to what's called callback hell. All right. And promises can slow things down. Async await, which is the newest, is probably the best. However, there is still plenty of code out there that uses callback and or uses promises. All right. So one of the simplest examples, and it's the one that's given most often, all right, of how to use callbacks is timers. As it says, timers are not part of JavaScript. Rather, timers are provided by the browser. All right, it says, let's talk about one of the timers we have, the set timeout. Set timeout, as mentioned there, accepts two arguments, a function and a number. That number is in milliseconds, where 1,000 milliseconds equals 1 second. It's how long you want to wait before the function is run. So here we want to wait 2 seconds and then run this. All right. So that console.log will be executed after 2 seconds. Why is that important? Because in the mainstream of things, if you're doing a lot of operations that could be tying up network resources, you could have a bunch of timeouts in there. And you could say, hey, wait before doing this. So I could go on and do something else and then come back and do this. And there might be several of these in there. It says if you add a console log before and one after it, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see before, then it's going to see this, and it's going to wait 2 seconds, so it's going to write after. Then it'll say inside the function. All right? And that's what timers can do. A timer is a method. It's a way of doing a callback. So what we're saying is run this function. Oh, wait 2 seconds. Run this function, then call back, and run that function. So as it says, the callback function is actually executed asynchronously. As mentioned, this is a very common pattern when you're doing anything that could take what the computer might consider to be an inordinate amount of time. Again, notice as they say here, all of the things explained here are not core JavaScript. All right? But it says you'll find lots of examples in some of his other handbooks. Okay, I'll believe you. Okay, says here's how we can implement callbacks in our code. We define a function that accepts a callback. All right, we define a function that accepts a callback parameter, which is a function. So this is a function. When the code is ready to invoke the callback, we pass it the result. So as it says, code using the function would look like this. Now, what happened with that is you end up having a callback that's waiting for a callback, that's waiting for a callback, etc. And there actually is a website out there that's called callbackhell.com, because that's what this is referred to. And it's very short. This is the whole site right here, just a few pages. But it does give an explanation of what this is. So as mentioned there, asynchronous JavaScript, I should say, uses callback, is hard to get right intuitively. A lot of code ends up looking like this. All right, where you've got this within this, within this, within this, etc. It says, see the pyramid shape and all of these at the end. This is affectionately known as callback hell. The cause is when people try to write JavaScript in a way where execution happens visually from top to bottom. Callbacks, as it says, are just the name of a convention for using JavaScript function. They're nothing special called a callback in JavaScript itself. All right, and how do you fix that? Well, it says first keep your code shallow. So it says here is some messy code that uses the browser request. It has two anonymous functions, so let's not make them anonymous, let's give them names. By giving them names, rather, it makes the code easier to read. And when exceptions happen, it makes, when you've got a stack backtrace, it makes you let you know where it actually failed. It allows you to move the functions around and reference them by their names. The most important part, as it says, write small modules that each do one thing. That was what I gave as part of the definition earlier for an actual function. Handle every single error that can possibly happen. So, to summarize here, it says don't nest functions, use function hoisting, and if you need a better explanation, you can click the link right here. Handle every error in one of your callbacks. Use a linter to make sure you're doing that, and create reusable functions. When you create modules, I'm not going to read to you. Here are some rules of thumb. So it says, try reading my longer introduction to callback, or try out some of the Node School tutorials. So if you click right there, boom, you can find out some more information. All right, I'm just going to leave it at that. So what came basically after callbacks were promises. As it says, promises represent an alternative way of dealing with the asynchronous code and the possible problems we discussed earlier. All right, it says, as we saw in a previous chapter, with callbacks, we'd be passing in a function to another function call that would be called when the function is finished processing, like this. So when do something ends, it calls the function received as a parameter. So when this function ends, it's going to call that. The main problem, as mentioned here with this approach, is that you need to use the result of the function in the rest of your code. So all that, there's a lot of nesting, and that's what led to that callback hell. All right, this is a simple example. So promises are one way of dealing with this. So, when we talk historically about how this worked, we started with callbacks, and then we went to promises. And as you'll see in just a couple minutes, from there we went to the async await. All right. So what's kind of neat about this is notice with a promise-based, we do something dot then. So you end up with a bunch of dot then statements. We first call the function, then have a then method that is called when the function ends. The indentation doesn't matter, but you'll oftentimes use it for clarity like this. So this, do something, this will be if everything works, and this is what you'll be able to do if you get some kind of error is encountered. It says now to be able to use this syntax, this must be a little bit special. It must use the promises API. So instead of declaring it like this, you declare it like this. So do something now becomes a new promise, and we pass a function in the promise constructor like this. The function is mentioned, receives two parameters. Now, before we even get into this, which we will, but before we do, a promise really can be in one of three states. It can, whatever you ask to have happen, can happen successfully. If that's the case, the promise is resolved. All right? That can be unsuccessful, in which case the promise is rejected. And if it's not in any of those, it can be basically in a pending type of state, not a pending, in a state that is called pending. Now think about it this way if this confuses you. You come into Rankin Technical College and you sign up for the AWD1111 class. All right? And you say, can I pay by check? And they say, well, yeah, I guess so. All right? So you pay by check, but until they cash that check, you're not technically, even though if it says you're in the class, technically you're not. You're pending. All right, if they take that check to the bank and the bank says that's fine, they cash the check, the promise has been resolved. If you take that check to the bank and the bank says, we can't, the person has insufficient funds for this, it's rejected. So as it says here, resolving means completing it successfully, all right, which results in calling the then method. Rejecting means there was an error, which calls the catch. All right, so rejecting a promise means ending it with an error. We're going to see this stuff again and again as we go on, okay? Finally, we've got async and await, and this pretty much, I think we have to talk about this and then scope, and then we'll be done with this particular handbook. So async functions, as it says, they offer a higher level of abstraction over promises. Okay? So forget about this. This is what we just looked at. But when you start doing async and await, you need to put the word async in there, which means you're using something asynchronously. And everything you want to run asynchronously, you put await in front of. So as it says, async functions are a higher level abstraction over promises. An async function returns a promise. Any code that wants to use this function must use the await keyword before the function. In doing so, any data returned by the promise is going to be assigned, in this case, to the data variable. It says with one particular caveat, whenever we use the await keyword, we must do so inside of a function that has async inside of it. Why? Because as mentioned here, the async await duo allows us to have cleaner code and a simple mental model to work with the asynchronous code. All right. And I'm not going to lie to you and say, that's pretty simple, right? All right. It's a little bit complex. But when you look in here, it says, as an example, here's how you would get a JSON resource using fetch and then parse it. All right. So you've got all these dot thens. And technically, there should be a dot catch in here because any one of these can fail. So when you do that using async await, you end up getting this. It's considered to be a cleaner way of doing things. It's considered to be a way that you should be doing things. I'll just leave it at that. All right. And finally, we talk about scope. As it says, when the author introduced variables, they talked about const, about let, and var. All right. In JavaScript, you've got global scope, block scope, and function scope. If you define a variable typically at the top of your JavaScript program, outside of any function or code block, it's global, which means it's available to every part of the program without it having to be passed in. I'm not going to read about this difference between var, let, and const. I'm not going to do that right now. All right. So that is global scope. All right. Block scope means that you defined it within a set of curly braces. All right. So that will end up being const and let. So it's only available where it's defined. The block is with whatever's within the curly braces. And they go into it a little bit more about var and const. I think that's pretty good for right now. So what I'm going to do next, and I've already mentioned this, but I'm going to say it again anyway. We have now finished with our HTML handbook. What the heck happened here? How did I close everything else? Good gosh. Okay, I don't know what I did. All right. But I do know what I've done. I somehow managed to open this thing. Oh, good gravy. All right, let me just fix this and then we'll be ready to rock and roll. Put it right there and then move it over. All right, so I have finished with the HTML handbook. I have finished with the CSS handbook. I have now finished with the JavaScript handbook. Before I go on and do the Node and the React handbooks, I'm going to go back, and as I mentioned to you previously, I am going to go back and I'm going to go over the material in Chapter 4, which discusses functions. All right, maybe we'll even go over the events. I don't think we have to go over the object stuff here, but I'll probably go over the last 20 or so pages in here. Then when I get done with that, I'm going to jump into Chapter 15 and talk about how to work with data or arrays, sets, and maps. Finally, I'm going to go in and talk about how to work with Node.js. And I don't think with this, let's see, with the DOM stuff, I don't think it's going to really help to go over that. So what I'm going to do next is do some review from our book, and I'm going to make a presentation on Chapter 4. I'm going to make a presentation on Chapter 15. And I'm going to make a presentation on Chapter 19. Again, I could talk about functions in here. We could talk some more about this, the ifs, etc. All right. I could also go in and go over Chapter 18 and talk something about Ajax. And we will do a little bit of Ajax stuff, to be honest with you, a little later. But after I get done with those, I'm going to jump into, as I've already mentioned, and I'm doing this out of order. It just hit me to do this because I realized I've got the book. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to go over the Traversy Web Dev Guide. All right. And after we get done with that, I want to write a couple of JavaScript programs so you can see them in action in a couple different ways. All right. and then we'll jump into the server-side stuff. All right? Hopefully all of that made at least a little bit of sense to you.